Hi guys, welcome to the channel. I've done a number of storytime videos for my Space Marine chapter known as the 13th. It's basically like a mini audio thing for you guys to listen to while you're painting. This is the latest one. If you're new to the Storytimes, then go back and have a look at the playlist. There's a Storytime tutorial playlist. There's a Storytime playlist somewhere. And they should really be listened to in sequential order. So if you're new, then I'd recommend going back and listening to some of the old ones. But or you can just jump in and listen to this one straight away, because in this one, we answer the question whether the 13th will get a chapter master. So let's begin. He looked down at his hands, old now. Once they were full of light, but they were old now, lined with age, scarred by war. He could not remember a time without war, only war. Solgaro looked across the battlefield. It was grey and dead and cold. Ranks of armour lay broken in the field. Lines of razor wire chinked in the breeze, and bodies. There were bodies everywhere, very few of them whole. This had been his work. This was his victory. It didn't feel like a victory. Behind him reared the fortress walls, black cliffs reaching all the way to the stars. A cut, a breach, had broken the walls in two, wide enough for a tank and filled with bodies. Thousands of bodies. Mutants and cultists, broken and cold. Atop a mound of corpses in the centre of the breach, a single banner hung limply. A banner of the 13th. He remembered his men fighting around him, dying around him, the crash of explosions, the scream of flamers, hard rounds pinging from his armour. He remembered the last charge of Garrod's platoon, the last of the Militarum. More of a stumbling run, really, the ground was so uneven. Garrod pushed the enemy back for a moment, allowing the 13th Astartes to regroup. That moment had given them 10 more minutes, was only 10 minutes. It had felt like 10 years. 10 years in the breach until only he and Dersius had remained. Brave Dersius, laughing as he killed. A great last stand, Dersius had said, his chainsword whirring around him. One for the Hall of Records. They'll make you chapter master for this. Then a mining laser had cut Dersius in two, and he finally stopped laughing. Solgaro had fought on. That was all he could do. That was all he ever did. Solgaro looked back towards the banner of the 13th standing alone in the breach, the pole jammed through the gut of a dead warrior, the cloth barely moving in the breeze. It was so thick with blood, so much blood. He wondered if they had heard his call. Had anyone? His helmet had been ripped from his head so long ago, thousands of years ago. Perhaps he was the last, again, the last Astartes, the last Space Marine. 48 hours earlier, Solgaro had entered the stratagem and was surprised by what he found there. Usually the stratagem was filled with field commanders for the upcoming mission, and the field commanders only. Half a dozen souls at most. It was the last conclave before the drop, and that was how it was done. Not this time. This time they were all there. Sagan Mir, Tractatus, and a number of the librarius off to one side. Captain Morsus pacing back and forth as he always did. Gabriel Locke, his friend, looked stern, angry even, staring across the stratagem table at Captain Talus. Talus was second generation Primaris, and Krieger, Thule, Ridley, and other second generation stood with him. Funny how they always seemed to move together. The fact that Chaplain Snow was there would have been surprising on its own. He never came to these things. Snow did not mix well with others. No, what was most surprising was that two ancient brothers also shared the stratagem. Callius Tomb, Chaplain Dreadnought, hero of the Galmec incident, and ancient brother Matthias, the best of them, a huge and immobile shadow at the back of the room, watching, listening, patient. Solgaro knew that Matthias would hate being there. He hated anything but war. The stratagem was a large room of cogitators and hololiths. The table in the middle was lit with a 3D display of the target zone. Blips moved across it. It changed in real time. Typically the room would be alive with noise as the latest comms came through, but the channels had been muted and the machine spirits silenced. They did not like being silenced. The spirits burped and grumbled in the background like angry children. Lights flashed for attention. "You're late," growled Snow. "I was with the Militarum," said Solgaro as he entered, "prepping for the drop." "See," said Captain Tallis. "That's why it should be him." Tallis was tall. All the Primaris were tall. But he looked taller still in his sleek Phobos battle plate. He was an easy man to like, not only for his battle honours, but because he smiled often. He was optimistic, something of a rarity in the 13th. "We need a chapter master," said Tallis. "We've had this conversation," said Solgaro. "All of us, many times." "But there is consensus now," said Sagan Mir quietly. So that was why they had come, thought Solgaro. Still, it begged the question. "Before a drop?" he asked. "Regardless of consensus, this is not the time." "It is exactly the time," said Tallis. "If there was a chapter master, a unifying force before the shattering, before the death of hope, before a dozen other war zones, things would have been different." "Subjective," said Solgaro. "You posit our interconnectedness is a weakness. I say it is a strength." A number of other officers nodded at this. Solgaro marked them. It was clear that some consented, but not all. Gabriel Locke looked angry, and Snow always looked angry. Then Tallis spoke. "They say you're the oldest, so I say it should be you." He pointed to the hulking form of Matthias at the back of the room. "Even our ancient brother here defers to you, though I don't know why." Matthias said nothing, watching, listening. "The 13th have no master," said Solgaro. "Manus was the first and last. There is no process by which to elevate someone, and we should not create one." "We could," whispered Sagan Mir. "Make one." "Or we could ask the Primarchs," said Tallis. "No," said Matthias loudly through his Vox speaker. "We do not concern the Lord Commander with petty affairs of rank. We follow and we thank him for it. Think on your hubris, Captain Tallis." Tallis bowed. "Of course," he said. "We've been round this circle before," said Solgaro, "and we circle it again. It should be put to rest." "Then agree," said Tallis simply. "Astartes should be led by a chapter master. It is written in the Codex. It is how we function. It is how we fight." "Not always was it so," said Solgaro, looking across at the first-generation Marines, those that knew his story. "And the 13th are more than Astartes. We're a fleet. Putting thoughts of mortals to one side, which is onerous in itself, but putting thoughts of them to one side, the 13th were founded as equals from many different chapters, from many different creeds, and, over time, from many different ages. We stand apart, and we stand stronger for it. The center cannot be broken because there is no center. We can shatter and be remade. We can lose hope. We can lose wars, men and machines, and we can break. We have broken, but we do not bend. Not one of us bends, not now, and not ever." Sagan Mir nodded solemnly. "You're a fine man," he said. "That's why it must be you." Solgaro shook his head and looked across the table at Chaplain Snow. Snow glared back. "You've been quiet, my friend," said Solgaro. "What do you say?" "He's right, you know," hissed Snow. "And you made his case stronger with your pretty words, but he's right. We need to put this behind us once and for all." "You agree with him?" "I don't care," growled the chaplain, "but we must put this behind us." "And how do we do that?" asked Solgaro. "Simple," said Snow. "We're Astartes. We fight." 48 hours later, a Thunderhawk with Storm Talon escorts dropped down from the clouds towards the fortress. The fortress was a massive thing, the size of a small city, and the 13th had deployed in force to hold the front and break the cultist against the gates. The front had held. The front had held easily because that was not where the main attack had come. The main attack had come from the rear. No one had predicted it because no one believed the cultists had the strength to breach the rear walls. They had never been breached, not since the fortress was raised 3,000 years earlier. The walls were too high, too strong, too impossible to bring down, but the cultists had brought them down. They were miners, after all. They must have dug through sheer granite and packed the tunnels with enough explosives to crack open a titan. Whatever they had done, it had worked, and a gap had opened up in the impossible walls. Inside the Thunderhawk, Captain Talus prepared his men for combat insurgence. It would be hot, and they knew it. Though a flight of storm talons followed him down, he wondered if he had enough gun. The walls had been breached, and so the fortress would fall. He was sure of it. They all were. After the walls had fallen, the tactical auspex had lit up, and the battlesphere had changed. There were suddenly thousands of contacts out in the wastes, streaming towards the breach. The perfect ambush. Before the battle, he knew that Solgaro had been roving inside the fortress with a strike force of Astartes and 10 platoons of the 13th Militarum, waiting to respond to a surprise attack. Others had questioned his actions. Talus had thought it was a waste of resource. There could be no more surprises. There had been enough surprises. The cultists had played all their cards and played them well, which is why the 13th had retreated to the fortress. But when the walls were breached, Solgaro and his company had raced to fill it. He had been right to hold on to a mobile reserve, as though he had seen something no one else had seen, like a chapter master, thought Talus. But one company against thousands? They could not hold the breach. No one could hold the breach. When Talus gathered his fast response team and first boxed through to Solgaro, all he could hear was a wall of noise and war. He needed data, dispositions and armament, so he could select the right tools for the job, but nothing could be heard except chaos. Solgaro had not responded. A chopped message from a Militarum sergeant was cut short, and then identifiers began to wink out. Battle codes were scrambled, and high-sat images became a blur as smoke and heat filled the target zone. Talus tried the comms again. Nothing. Dead air. "Captain," called the tech marine pilot, "you'd better take a look at this." Talus left his men and came to the cockpit as the Thunderhawk banked for its final approach. He looked down, expecting to see a maelstrom of enemy machines and infantry streaming through the breach in the walls. Instead, he saw a graveyard. Broken vehicles, bodies, and steaming craters stretched away from the walls. Apart from the smoke and patches of flame, it was very still. Nothing was moving. The Thunderhawk touched down. Overhead, talons zipped by, chasing for targets that were not there. The Thunderhawk, still creaking with the heat of re-entry, blew its bolts and ramps thumped down, and Marines came quickly out. Combat spread, guns switching right and left, auspex singing. Captain Talus ran down the front ramp and stared at the breach in the walls. A jagged cut and mounds of rubble and bodies filled the breach, and in the centre, standing on its own, a banner of the 13th. It was riddled with bullet holes and dripping blood, yet still it stood. Immovable. He felt pride stir in his chest, but also caution. Had the enemy put it there? Was this another trap? Behind the standard, from out of the black, a lone space marine climbed into the light. He moved slowly, purposefully, as though he was old beyond measure or perhaps worn thin by endless war, only war. His helmet was missing and his armor was in ruins, but still he stood by the banner, a power sword fizzing in his fist, a burning blade. Talus dropped to one knee. "Master," he said. "Get up, Captain," said Solgaro. "There are no masters here, only the honored dead." Talus stood and looked around him at the butchery and devastation. He counted loyalist Militarum and Astartes amongst the corpses, but so few compared to the ranks of the enemy, now broken and beaten beneath the impossible walls. "How many made it through?" he asked. "None. We held." "How many Marines stand with you?" "None. I am the last Space Marine." 1 week later, in the primary hangar of the battleship Defiant, the question that Talus had sought an answer, whether there should be a chapter master at the 13th, would finally be decided. The hangar bay was full, beyond full, rammed with Astartes, Militarum, Navy troopers and ratings, and even important civilians from the estate. Pick cameras were set up to broadcast the occasion. Matthias had decreed that there should be as many witnesses as possible and that it should happen in the hangar where as many of them could fit, and his wisdom, as ever, was never questioned. So the hangar bay was emptied of its armour and machines of war, and filled with tens of thousands of chattering souls, staring down at the combat arena in the centre. A square had been marked out, 13 metres by 13, and in it 2 warriors would fight to determine the future of the 13th. Snow had suggested the format. Agreement had been reached. Rules had been set. A duel. If Talus won, then the 13th would nominate a chapter master. If Solgara won, there would be no chapter master. Not now, not ever. They would fight until the other submitted or could not continue. Be that unconsciousness or trauma. Simple rules. Snow liked simple rules. However, as no one could envisage a scenario where one of them would back down and submit, everyone thought it would be a long and bloody fight, finished with trauma, finished with blood loss. And then objections had arisen. A day before the fight, the objections grew louder amongst the civilians and consumed the fleet. Money stopped changing hands. Fights broke out among the civilians. The Astartes ignored it until a man was killed. A civilian on the face of the sea. His name had been Dengal. He had left behind 3 young children who he cared for, who depended on him. He had waged Solgara would lose in the first 60 seconds. These bets were getting wiped, early losses. There was a growing feeling amongst the civilians that Solgara would throw the fight. That evening, with 9 hours to go, the Astartes changed the combatants, and peace was quickly restored. And so it was that Solgara stood in full armour in the fighting square next to his old friend, Chaplain Snow. Chaplain Snow was stripped down to a body glove and held a gladius in his hand. He held the sword the wrong way, pommel up, and blade down, as if he did not know what to do with it. In fairness, he had not held a gladius for the best part of 100 years. Solgara shook his head. Again. "You're a fool, Julius," he said. "It had to be me," said Snow angrily. "No one would believe I could throw a fight. And no one should think I could throw one either." "Forgive them their sins," said Snow. "They are mortal and full of doubts. This was not about them." "It's always about them," said Snow. "Astartes exist because there is an Imperium. The 13th exist because there is a fleet." Did you rehearse that one?" smiled Solgara. Snow snarled. His colourful response was drowned in noise as a second figure entered the fighting square and the crowd cheered, brayed and stamped their feet. Captain Talus, Primaris, 2nd generation, was also stripped to his body glove and swung a gladius through the air like he knew how to use it, like he had been practicing. He rolled his neck, stretched his legs, swung the gladius some more. Solgara shook his head, again, knowing full well that the captain had no need to warm his muscles or stretch his tendons. He was Astartes. He was always ready for war. "He's a big lad," growled Snow. "You're going to lose," said Solgara. "He's Primaris. He's faster, bigger, stronger." Snow grinned. "I've got 400 years of experience on that boy." "Younger," said Solgara. "You're old, you know. Really old." Snow laughed. "A rare thing." "Thanks. A bit of anger always helps." "You're always angry," said Solgara, "and stubborn. Neither of those things will help you now, not one-on-one. How on Terra do you think you can beat him?" "Easy," growled Snow, patting his old friend on the arm. "I fight dirty." A klaxon sounded and the crowd quietened. Words were spoken from Talus and Solgara, and a few mortals had been given time for speeches. The rules of the fight were repeated. There would be no bouts or rounds. There would be no rest until one submitted or could fight no longer. All understood and agreed to the risks. Then a second klaxon sounded, and the fight began. What should have happened, and what usually happened when 2 Astartes duelled with each other, was not what happened here. Usually there would be a testing out period, lunges and feints as each swordsman got the measure of the other. It could be minutes before the true fight began. Instead, Chaplain Snow fought dirty. When the second klaxon sounded, Snow raced across the fighting square and launched himself at Talus. Talus could have stepped out of the way, but he saw an opening and he took it. Snow was not adequately defending himself, and so Talus swung his gladius and met the onrushing Chaplain. His gladius thumped solidly into Snow's side. The reinforced fused ribcage of an Astartes is incredibly tough. Snow took the force of the blow against his ribs as the gladius struck solid into the bone, and he did not stop moving straight into the captain. His sword arm came up, pommel first, and smashed Talus straight in the groin, at full swing. Full, transhuman swing. At the same time he lunged forward and his forehead smashed into the captain's nose. It broke with a crack and a flash of blood. The captain fell back, Snow on top of him. The back of the captain's head cracked off the reinforced deck plates. Snow kept pounding, butting, as fast as an Astartes could. It was over in 3 seconds. It took the apothecaries another 10 seconds to pull Snow away. In the years that followed, when asked about the fight in the hangar bay, Snow would grunt and ignore any questions. However, if someone had the guts to say to him that it was not a fair fight, an honourable fight, he would often reply, "I cracked him in the balls with a pommel. I could have used the sharp end." When Talus awoke in the apothecarium, hours had passed. His cranium, nose, and cheekbones had been stitched back together using synthetic bone fibers. His accelerated physiology would take care of the rest. There was a thick headache, a lump between the eyes that pain suppressants could not fill. His arms felt heavy, his body felt heavy, and his legs would not move. Around him machines beeped and purred. Beneath it all he could feel a deep engine thrum, the heart of the battleship, pulsing slowly. "I lost," he said to himself. A face looked down at him, a strong, battle-worn face. It took him longer than he would have liked to realize it was Captain Ridley, Primaris. "Never fight a chaplain," said Ridley. "So much faith and fury in them. They do like to vent it on others." "I lost," said Talus. "The 13th lost. Lost their way." "I think they follow their own path," said Ridley. "There is one path," said Talus. "All other paths lead to heresy, betrayal, the end of empires. You should rest. Find yourself again." "They were renegades, Ridley. Did you know that? Even the Inquisition hunted them." "That was before Guilliman," said Ridley. "And with a word all was forgiven," said Talus. "The impure made pure with a word. No, it runs deep in them, like a cancer. It festers still." "You're confused," said Ridley. "You should rest." Buttons were pressed and chemicals saturated the captain's body. His mind turned grey. Talus faded. "Impure," he whispered. "A cancer. Deep. I shall cut it out." So ends this story time. The 13th will not have a chapter master, not now, not ever. They follow their own path. Thanks for listening. Happy wargaming.